Thanks to the organizers, organizing under difficult conditions. It's great to be virtually in Milan. Of course, it would be even greater to be physically in Milan, but hopefully we'll get that chance. This is a paper with Elchanan that I've had trouble presenting in an hour and a half, so I'm not sure what 20 minutes is going to do, but we'll give it a go. As the title suggests, it was inspired by the Trump tariffs on China, which got us thinking about how tariffs of that magnitude that came as a surprise might affect and disrupt global supply chains. As you know, the tariffs on intermediate goods pre-Trump tariffs are low. We're low, or continue low around the world, and we're low in the U.S. We did some calculations using Chad Bound's data and Amity Redding and Weinstein data, and found that average U.S. tariffs on intermediate goods were less than 1% before Trump came along. As you can see from our calculations here, on China, as late as 2017, the average tariff on intermediate goods was about 2.5%. And then all of a sudden, these tariffs fell disproportionately on intermediate goods, and they rose up to nearly 25%. So we were interested in what effects such change in policy, sudden change in policy, would have on supply chains. We read lots of business press suggesting that supply chains indeed were disruptive. You read about shifting from China to Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. You read about Trump hoping for and rooting for resourcing, which I'm not sure we saw in the data. You read about a lot of industries being affected, a lot of firms being affected. Only slightly less anecdotally, we took the data from Chad and from Mary et al. And applied the kind of diff and diff methodology that we've become familiar with on the effects of the Trump tariffs, looking instead at how imports from China of intermediate goods and imports from other low-cost Asian countries, 13 of them, of intermediate goods, were affected by the difference in the tariff rates on imports from China versus imports from the rest of the world. As you know, most of the tariffs on China were discriminatory, though not all of them. The steel ones weren't. In any case, we look for evidence of supply chains shifting, and indeed the direct effect is exactly what you would expect. There was a huge effect of the difference in tariffs on how much U.S. was importing of intermediate goods from China, and some evidence that indeed it was shifting to other countries. These supply chains were moving to other countries in response. So this is hardly the last word on the empirics of the disruption, but it's at least suggestive and gave us cause to plow forward. So we wanted to think about how tariffs on intermediate goods in the context of supply chains might be different from tariffs on, ordinary intermediate goods that are just, purchased on anonymous markets. And so we tried to build a model that captured the key features that make supply chains distinctive. And here we relied on the first chapter of the World Development Report, which was mostly written by Paul Antros, so we can all trust it as being gospel. And what Paul wrote were roughly 6 distinctive features of supply chains. First of all, that they were made possible by the fragmentation of the production process. That's why it's a chain. Second, that they involve and impose non-trivial search costs as firms go out to look for potential suppliers. That you have to find someone's compatible, that not every match is going to be a good one. And so the potential suppliers need to match well with the buyers, or the suppliers have to be suitable to the buyers. That when matches take place, they're often governed by incomplete contracts that can be renegotiated, and that often, because of the some costs involved, that the relationships are durable or sticky. All of these features are ones we're going to include in our modeling. These are the features that we wanted to capture. We would have also liked to capture relationship-specific investments, which have been studied by Ornelas and Turner and Pohl and Steger in some papers that you're probably familiar with. For the time being, we set these to the side, maybe because they're already partially understood. Of course, there could be interactions here, but we're going to put these to the side and focus on these new elements. And what we're interested in is unanticipated tariff shocks, fairly large ones, on how they affect the organization of supply and prices and welfare. So fairly standard set of questions in a slightly more rich environment than we might be familiar with from modeling of trade policy. So I don't have time, of course, to go through the details of the model, but I can sketch it and emphasize the elements that are unfamiliar. So the familiar part, two sectors, a homogeneous good with constant returns to scale, all the action in a differentiated product sector. Think Venables 87, monopolistic competition, and these are where the relational supply chains will form and be used in production. To produce differentiated products involves a Cobb-Douglas combination of labor and a composite intermediate good. And then the composite involves a continuum of different particular inputs, which we're going to assume are combined in fixed proportions, although that could be relaxed. That's the easiest case to consider. Firms forming these supply chains are going to import each of the inputs from the cheapest source, or we say have the opportunity to produce them at home, but for most of the paper, that's not going to be the best option. And then here's where the new action is going to come in. So final producer bears costly search costs, pays costly search costs to find a supplier of each input. Each supplier has a match-specific productivity, so it could be a good match or a bad match, compatible or not. And when you find somebody, when the buyer's supplying somebody, you face a choice. You can negotiate a contract, a supply contract with that supplier, or you can say, this is not a very good match. I'm going to continue my search until I find somebody better. We're going to start in a long-run equilibrium, a zero profits equilibrium, and anticipation of free trade. So the firms form their supply chain expecting a low tariff, let's say zero. We could make it anything you want as long as it's a low, and then that's going to give us an initial equilibrium from which we're going to shock it with an MIT shock, an unexpected tariff. Let me say just a few words about search and bargaining, since this is the new elements here. So first of all, we're going to assume symmetry across all final producers and all of the inputs. It would be nice to allow some asymmetry so that you had multi-country supply chains. You buy some things, some countries have comparative advantage in some set of inputs, others have comparative advantage elsewhere. Unfortunately, not today. So therefore, all producers initially search in the cheapest country, think China. Okay, so the initial equilibrium, everyone's searching for all their inputs in China. The way you search is you pay F. When you pay F, you take a draw from a distribution of match productivities for the input that you're looking for. You then learn the inverse productivity A. So defined as if you find somebody with an A, that supplier can produce what you need at a unit cost W, the wage, times A. So you want A to be low, of course. And now you have the choice, as I said, to either negotiate a contract with that supplier with the productivity A, inverse productivity A, or pay F again and take another draw. Now, a key simplifying assumption that makes all of this tractable for us is that although the firm produces through time, it can do its draws very quickly. It can do its search process very quickly. There's no time between the draws at all. Allowing time between draws would introduce some really interesting dynamics. You might find a supplier, start working with that supplier while you continue to look for yet someone better, but that was complicated. So at least for today, the key assumption that makes life simple is no time between draws. Okay, so the optimal strategy for each firm, for each input, is to have a stopping rule, a reservation price, if you will, a reservation productivity, A bar, such that if you meet or exceed that productivity, you find an A that's less than or equal to A bar, you stop. Otherwise, you continue drawing. And that gives us a really simple formula for the search cost. So given A bar, which is the firm is going to choose, the search costs, well, up front you pay F. With probability G of A bar, you're done because you find somebody that's good enough. With probability 1 minus G bar, you're back to the starting line, and then you have to pay the full cost S again and draw again and so on. So substituting the cost as a function of the stopping rule is F over capital G of A bar, which you see couldn't possibly be simpler. Bargaining, we have Nash bargaining with each of the suppliers with weights beta, exogenous weights beta, and 1 minus beta. We assume Nash and Nash. What does that mean? It means that this firm buyer is going to negotiate with a continuum of suppliers. So it has to have thoughts about how those other bargains are going to come out, and the Nash and Nash, as you can imagine, means that the firm will take as given the outcome of all the negotiations with all the other suppliers. This has been criticized in context with a small number of parties who can do better by negotiating jointly rather than taking everything else as given. We think with a large number of suppliers, and in particular a continuum of suppliers, in a world of social distancing, it would be very hard to get all those suppliers in the same room to negotiate simultaneously. So we think this is a good assumption in our context. What it means is that since you need M of each of your inputs, you're going to agree on an M with everybody else. In each individual bargain, the parties will take M as given. So the firm will decide how many composite inputs it wants, and then it'll negotiate to buy M inputs from each supplier it finds. You can negotiate, of course, against outside options. So the outside options for the buyer, as I said, are to resume search. If you resume search, you're going to find another supplier that has an expected price given by some amount, depending upon your stopping rule. And you're going to have to pay the fixed costs, the search costs again. For the supplier, we assume that they can have many relationships, but they're all separable. So the outside option from this negotiation breaking down is 0. So then if you solve the Nash problem, the cost that the final producer pays to a supplier to purchase an amount M of the intermediates is the wage in China, the conditional expectation of the draw of A in China, conditional on the stopping rule, the number that you buy, plus the search costs, which includes 2 components. One is right up front, you have to pay a search cost. And second, as part of the negotiation, and this is important, as part of the negotiation, your outside option is deflated by the fact that if you have to go back and pay another surge cost, that's bad for your, that cuts into surplus that is borne by you, and so that affects as well the bargain that comes out. So an important thing to observe here is that the cost of M intermediates has these two components, a part that depends on M linearly and a part that doesn't. And therefore, of course, that the perceived marginal cost to the firm of when it chooses M, when it chooses how many inputs to buy and how much labor to use, that perceived marginal cost here is less than the average cost. And I'll come back to why that matters in a little bit. Okay, so the free trade equilibrium, as I say, anticipation of free trade. The stopping rule minimizes the trade-off between the cost of the inputs and the search costs. So choosing a stringent requirement for the compatibility will lead to lower costs of production, but higher search costs. So that's the fundamental trade-off. And the key thing that comes out of this is that the greater the stake the firm has in this search, in the sense of how many inputs it wants to buy and what the wage rate is in China, the greater the stake, the more stringent will be the more intense will be its search. Okay, so we start the tariff analysis from a zero profit equilibrium with these features that minimizes this and all the other stuff that you're familiar with. We shock the system with an ad valorem tariff. We assume it's unanticipated. We assume that the number of firms that have entered in the free trade equilibrium is predetermined. And as long as they can cover their variable costs, they're not going to leave having already borne entry costs. Okay, so we have to distinguish, we have to distinguish two different sizes of tariffs. All of these are going to be relatively large, finite tariffs, but still we call one set of tariffs small tariffs and another set of tariffs large tariff. The distinction is if the tariff rate is smaller than the relative wage in Vietnam versus China, then even with the tariff in place, new searches, if any, occur, and threatened searches in the context of bargaining are going to remain in China. So let's say a 10% tariff. If Trump's tariffs had been 10%, maybe all the firms would have kept their supply chains in China and not started looking elsewhere. Still, some of those relationships would endure, and now there's incentive to renegotiate the price on one side or the other. Either the buyer sees itself in a stronger bargaining position and says, I no longer want to pay the price I was paying before, or the sellers say, look, you guys have been screwed by the Trump tariffs. You're not in as strong a position as you were before. We want to share in that and get a higher price. So in particular, price is going to fall if credible threat of a more intensive search, if there's a credible threat of a more intensive search, because then the buyer is in a better position and the price is going to rise if the threat is less discerning, if the buyer is in a worse position. Okay, so which is it going to be? Well, the optimal choice of A bar is decreasing it. Well, the stake that the firm has, the wage isn't changing, but now there's a tariff and there's the import level. So this is going to determine whether the threat becomes more intense or less intense. Input prices rise if and only if the stopping rule is less stringent than it was under free trade. That in turn happens if and only if the stake goes up from relative to free trade. So if there's a smaller stake, input prices will rise. And then finally, it turns out that the stake will go up relative to free trade if and only if the demand for the set of differentiated products is elastic. So it turns out elasticity of demand for the final products is another key parameter that determines qualitatively what's going to happen here. Notice that these are terms of trade effects coming from bargaining over a shared surplus. So this is a new element here, that the supply chains are going to have renegotiation in the face of short-term contracts, which are going to look from a welfare point of view like terms of trade effects. Okay, do the final producers replace any of their suppliers? Well, if they replace anybody, it stands to reason they're going to replace the least productive matches. Notice that we're still in the world of a small tariff. So the question is, with the small tariff, so we're going to stay in China, but we don't have to stay with our initial suppliers. We can go find new ones in China. So if epsilon is bigger than 1, if demand is elastic, then the stopping rule becomes less stringent. If the stopping rule is less stringent, then everybody you had to begin with already is better than your reservation price. Therefore, there's no point in going out and looking again, and therefore all the firms stick with their original suppliers. So to summarize, in the epsilon bigger than 1 case, there will be no replacement of any of the original suppliers, although there will be renegotiation with all of them. On the other hand, if demand is inelastic, then initially the stake goes up. Therefore, the search rule becomes more stringent at the initial end, which would tend to make for renegotiation in favor of the buyer. But something else happens, which is profitability in this industry rises thanks to the inelastic demand, that the price index goes up, which the tariff makes competition less fierce, so there's more entry. The entry reduces the stake of the original producers, and we show in the paper that that continues, in fact, until the tau times m returns exactly to what it was in free trade. Okay, so in the new equilibrium with entry in the inelastic case, we end up with the same stopping rule as initially, and again, no replacement of any suppliers. So from a welfare point of view, there are 3 effects. Let me describe them quickly. First of all, labor usage is going to fall. We're in a setting where the differentiated products have markup prices, so we have too little output of them relative to what's efficient. So the fall in labor demand is going to harm welfare. Skip this guy for a moment. Down here, we just said that in the elastic case, prices are going to go up because of renegotiation. So there's going to be an adverse terms of trade effect. And so that's also going to harm welfare. Finally, we have the change in the use of intermediates. If you ignore these guys for a moment, we have a term that looks just like this. So again, too little intermediates because there's too little production of the differentiated products due to monopoly pricing. That tends to be another welfare worsening effect. But these guys are here. So what are they saying? They're saying that the marginal cost of the composite of intermediate, we already said, was less than the average cost. The average cost is the true resource cost in terms of trade. So we're using too much labor and too little, too much intermediates and too little labor in production. To the extent that we reduce usage of intermediates, that's a potentially positive welfare, a second best positive welfare effect, coming from the fact that marginal and average cost of inputs are not the same in this setting. And therefore, there's a possible welfare enhancing effect. And indeed, this guy could be positive. We're not talking about small tariff changes, but large tariff changes. So you got to integrate these things up. But nonetheless, it could all turn out positive. To reassure you, when we stick some numbers in, it doesn't. So you don't have to worry about everything you've told your students being wrong in this context. Okay, very quickly, moving on to larger tariffs. Now, search will take place in country B rather than any new searches will take place in country B rather than A, in Vietnam rather than in China, or possibly there'll be resourcing. That is to say that the firms could move part of the supply chains back to the U.S. Now, if there's renegotiation, the threat is to go to country B, where the tariff can be avoided. If we stick with our supplier in A, we're still threatening to go to Vietnam. That gives us some extra bargaining power negotiating with that Chinese supplier. And in fact, now the terms of trade heads the other way because we can make the suppliers share in the burden of the tariff. This is very interesting to us because in the most recent Amity, Redding, and Weinstein paper, they in fact found that while the U.S. paid the Trump tariffs for final goods, for intermediate goods, they were somewhat shared. And so this is exactly what we're predicting here. So the reorganization of the supply chains, suffice it to say that if the tariff is large but not too large, then there's room to bargain about not moving to Vietnam because we can avoid the extra surge costs. If the tariff is still larger, indeed, some of the supply chain will move to China. Let me show you these graphs and then I'll stop. So these are simulations. These are our favorite numbers and most of your favorite numbers, sigma of 5. This is a Pareto spread parameter. Those match productivities of 4. Elasticity of demand 1.5. Cobb-Douglas labor share of 1/2. Bargaining powers 50-50. Chinese wage of 1/2 of the U.S. And Vietnam wage of 6/10 of the U.S. And what you see here is the non-monotonic terms of trade effects that I was describing. So here, tariffs in this range generated worsening of the terms of trade until we get up to the large tariff, 1.2. Now suddenly we make the Chinese suppliers share in the cost of the tariff, so the terms of trade are improving until this tariff where we start to actually replace some of the supply relationships. Then there are two offsetting effects. On the one hand, we're still shedding some of the burden onto the Chinese suppliers. On the other hand, we're replacing them in Vietnam. That you recognize as binary trade diversion. So that's an adverse terms of trade effect. And so those two forces offset and eventually the terms of trade deteriorate again. So very surprisingly, we get this very non-monotonic relationship. And I'll wrap up with the welfare curves. So for this case that I just described, welfare is declining with the tariff, despite the fact that it might be increasing due to that middle term. It's not, it's declining. And in fact, quite precipitously, the 20% Trump tariff leads to a 3% loss in welfare. In this little range here where the terms of trade are improving and we're not diverting trade to Vietnam, we get some rebound, but still never get back to the level of free trade. And then if we go further, we suffer further welfare losses. In the inelastic case, very flat in this range until we get up to the large tariff and then falling. If you had really good eyesight, or I blew this up, you would see that this is slightly increasing in here. So indeed, there is an optimum second best tariff in the range around 6-7% here, but it generates virtually no welfare gain. So you could visually, it's very flat. Here we make the demand very inelastic, and we give most of the bargaining power to the Chinese, just because Elfanon likes to be contrarian. And what we find in this case is indeed there's a significant or somewhat noticeable welfare gain coming from the fact that we can grab surplus from the Chinese if we threaten to and actually move a little bit to Vietnam. So welfare for a 20% tariff. And notice that here we have wages of 90% and 100%. So we had to construct this case, but you can see a welfare gain. What is striking is the second curve here, which makes country B the home country. In this case, if we manage to threaten to move or move production back to the US, we're reclaiming profits that are otherwise being gained by Chinese producers, and now they accrue to American producers, so they become again part of American welfare, and now we get substantial welfare gains. But before, so Elchanan likes this, but before you get too upset, notice that these require some rather extreme parameters, in particular that a lot of the bargaining power has to rest with the suppliers rather than the buyers.
Okay.
So I'm out of time, so I'll just let you read the conclusions, but you heard what I said, so we'll stop here.
Gene, thank you very much. This was a very, very interesting and very insightful paper, I must say. I have a question for you from Dalia Marin. I don't know if any of the panelists are willing. I can't see you all. Maybe Gene, can you remove the sharing of your screen so I have a vector picture of all the panelists? But I start with, thank you very much. I start with Dalia's question. If the supplier is specialized to the firm, how does it affect the outcome? How does the uncertainty of delivery of the input, that is the pandemic, affecting the outcome? So how another element of uncertainty, that could be the pandemic, can be affecting the outcome of your model?
So I see two questions there.
Yeah,
the first
exactly.
thing you said, if it's specialized to the buyer, so that's exactly what Ornelas and Turner and Antros and Steger about. That's missing from this model. There is no relationship-specific investments. They also find, in some cases, second best possibilities of welfare gains if there are insufficient incentives for investment in the relationship. But that's their work, that's not our work. So far we have nothing to say about the first part. The second part of the question was the uncertainty, and that's in fact what and the pandemic, and you'll have to stay tuned because that's exactly what we're going to be working on next, or we started to work on next.
Okay, so the issue is to stay tuned. Is there any question from the panel? Yes, Gianmarco.
This is a bit away from the paper itself, but I was wondering how sticky or flexible all these decisions are. So, for example, say that in a couple of weeks we have a different president with a different stance, which I'm not sure, but assume that this is the case in terms of the tariffs on China. So we would expect that everything goes back to the initial situation. So there is no lock-in that you can think of in terms of this re-optimization.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So this is a model that has, because of the sum cost element, it's not new, but it has, bold improvement type hysteresis. You put on a 20% tariff, you bear the cost of finding new suppliers, and then you take those tariffs off. You don't necessarily go back to where you were. First of all, you might find some new guys that you really like. And second of all, you've borne the costs. If you're going to go back, you have to be willing to bear the costs again to find somebody back in China, unless you can hold on to them during the interim. So I think in the spirit of your question, the answer is no, you won't go back to where you came from. Yes, there's a possibility here of hysteresis, or the likelihood of hysteresis.
Thank you.